A few months ago, I posted an episode about the renowned drawing of the Menorah created by the Rambam. I'm rebroadcasting this class today, this time with a link in the show's notes to the important PowerPoint presentation that has those images of the manuscripts that we will discuss. In this discussion, we dig into the story of Rambam's image. Where did it come from? Can we trust its accuracy? And most important, did later artists and copyists treat it as just a doodle or as something more meaningful?
So the topic for tonight is going to be the Menorah's image. We're all familiar with the following picture. The picture of the Knei HaMenorah, the branches of the Menorah, in a non-circular fashion, straight. And this picture comes from Lekutei Sichos Chelek Chaf Aleph, and we're all very familiar with this picture. The main thing I'd like to do tonight is to learn about the story of this picture, because this picture really does have a story, as a full biography of conception, adolescence, old age, afterlife, etc. So let's try to tell the story, and obviously the reason we're doing it now is because we're in the Tkuf of Bein HaMetzarim, and the Rebbe spoke about this topic of the shape of the Menorah. When was it? It was during Bein HaMetzarim. It was in Shabbos Parshas Matas Maseh, and then the next week Parshas Dvarim, Tov Mem Beis. The Rebbe wanted to discuss an Inyan in Hilchos Beis HaBchira, and that was the selected topic for those Shabboses. So it's appropriate, obviously, to do so today, as we're a few days before Tisha B'Av. So the story of this image, we're going to begin by looking at what we see on the screen. Actually, we'll come here in a second. First, I want to engage in some of the texts that we have on the page and read some of the texts, and then we'll come back to have an understanding about the image. So we'll begin at the first text on the handout. You'll notice the Gemara Menachos Daf Chav Ches Amud Beis. And here the Gemara Menachos is describing the shape of the Menorah, and the lashon that it uses is Ushnei Kanim Yotzim Mimenu, two branches are coming out from the central piece of the Menorah. Echad Elach ve'echad Elach, one going in to the right and one going to the left. And the lashon of the Gemara is V'nimshachim va'oilin, they continue and go up Keneged Goiva Shel Menorah until they reach the height of the central piece of the Menorah. You'll notice here that in this language there is no indication one way or another whether the branch is going out in a diagonal way, in the way we saw in the image before, or if it's going in a semicircular way. There's no indication from the Gemara either way. However, when we turn to Rashi in Shmois and Parshas Truma, Rashi quotes this Gemara and adds a crucial word. If you look at text 2, you'll see that Rashi says, Yoitze mitzidea, it's going out from the two sides. Rashi lekanu lekan ba'alachsoin, going out on an angle. Alachsoin is the word that is used almost always, if not always, by Chazal and by the Rishonim to refer to something that is going out on an angle. And in fact, as we'll see later, those who looked at Rashi understood Rashi to be saying that the Menorah's branches are not semicircular, but that they are straight. And he continues, Rashi then goes back to quoting from the Gemara, Nimshachim va'oilim ad keneged goiva shel Menorah. So literally he's lifting the language from the Gemara Menachos Daf Chav Ches, and he's just inserting that one word of alachsai. However, when we look at the Rambam in Hilchos Beis HaBchira, we notice that the Rambam sticks with the Gemara without adding that word. Look at text number 3. Ushnei kanim yoitzim mimenu zok the Rambam in Hilchos Beis HaBchira Perek Gimel. Echad heilach ve'echad heilach. One going in this direction, one going in the other direction. V'nimshachim va'elin keneged goiva Menorah, and they go up to the top of the Menorah. No, just like in the Gemara, no indication whether it's semicircular or whether it is on a straight angle. The discussion now picks up in the 1600s and the 1700s. This is where we have, really for the first time, a robust conversation amongst Chachmei Yisrael and Gedolei Yisrael about this issue. So the first person we're going to look at, his name was Rabbi Yosef Rikiti. He lived in Italy, and he wrote a sefer called Chachmas HaMishkan. At this time, in general, there were a few. It looks like there was a heightened interest in Inyanim about the Beis HaMikdash during this period in time, the 1500s and 1600s in Italy. And there's a number of works that were written that was dedicated to this subject. And it seems that Rabbi Yosef Rikiti is from this milieu. So his book is published in the year 1676, and he writes as follows: he's quoting from the Gemara and from the Rambam about the branches. He says, it seems to me that what the Rambam really means to say is that the branches of the Menorah are semicircular. Why? He doesn't really explain. He just says it seems to him that the Rambam holds they're semicircular. The Rashi pirish ba'alachsa nimshachim ba'elim. However, Rashi said that they go ba'alachsa. They're straight. Nirish hasoiver sha'olim ba'alachsa. So it seems that Rashi holds that they aren't curved. The lashon abraisa demlechas hamishkan nire kamoi Rambam shamar kan kein lashon nimshachim ba'elim. And there is the Braisa of Melechas HaMishkan. This is a work from the era of the Tanoim that deals with the Mishkan, and it uses that same language of Nimshachim V'oilim without using the word Ba'alachzain. And so therefore, it almost seems what Rabbi Yosef Rikiti is saying is if you say Alachzain, then you mean straight. But if you don't say, then by definition we think you mean semicircular. Somehow it almost sounds like that lack of saying anything means semicircular. That seems to be the implication that Yosef Rikiti is saying. A few decades later, another sage from Italy, a Mekobel, this time Rabbi Emmanuel Chai Riki. You may remember him. We spoke about Tzimtzum Kipshutoi. So we spoke about him. He's the author of Mishnas Chassidim. He also wrote a sefer called Ma'aseh Choshev. And in this sefer, he follows what Rabbi Yosef Rikiti and basically says the same thing and adds a few details. Let's see what he says inside. He says as follows. The branches go out from the central stem of the menorah. They go up in a circular fashion. This is what he writes. Then he explains. I just wrote be'igul. I want to be clear. I added the word eagle. It's not like you have that in the Rambam or in the Gemara or anything like that. According to Rashi, it would seem that you shouldn't say they're eagle. The Rambam didn't say alachsain. He just says they're going up. And so therefore, it sounds like because he doesn't say alachsain, again, the default is eagle. The default is circular. So if he didn't say alachsain, then I think he means circular. And now he's quoting Rabbi Yosef Rikiti. That it seems to him that means they look like rainbows. And this makes sense. Why? Because in this way they're similar to the planets. They're similar to the Galgalim. So when the Rambam talks about in Hilchos Yesod HaTorah, when he talks about the structure of the universe, so he says that outside of our world there is Galgalim, spheres. They're see-through, opaque, and it's the opposite of opaque, see-through, transparent. And in each one of the planets, in each one of these spheres has a planet, and the sphere moves and the planet moves. So he says that each one of these lamps of the menorah is doima to the shisha, to the galgalei arakiya hanoisim that carry shiva koichvei leches, the 7 planets, shekenegdam heim hashiva neiris, which correspond to the 7 candles. So this is if you take away our world and then you take away the planets that were discovered later. In the classical model, there were 7 planets corresponding to the 7 days of the week, and the menorah is. Each light of the menorah corresponds to one. Now, a galgal in this model that the Rambam describes, the galgal is a round sphere, and each planet dwells within that round sphere. So, if each light of the menorah is supposed to be connected and symbolic of one of these planets, and the planets sit inside one of these spheres, it makes sense that the menorah should therefore, the branches of the menorah should be semicircular, because then it's more similar to the Rekiim. This is the argument that Emmanuel Chai Riki says. In other words, again, they both agree. Rashi, halachzain. Halachzain means straight, like the picture of the Rambam. But that's Rashi. Whoever doesn't say it, it should be semicircular. Ubefrat, that it works out well in terms of the planets. This is what they say. Now, there was a mechaber of a sefer in Warsaw, printed in Tafresh Lamed Gimel in 1873, called Ezras Koyanim. It's a Pirush HaMaseches Midas. His name was Rabbi Yeshua Finberg. And he says, I don't understand what these rabbis are saying. They're both saying that the default is that it should be round. We need to ask ourselves, why should that be the default? In fact, if anything, the default should be the opposite. And he gives two reasons. One reason he gives is, how does the Torah use the word for the branches of the menorah? Acquainted. Acquainted. So let's take a biblical concordance and let's look, anytime the word kana appears in the Torah, what is it? So for example, in Parshas Miketz, it talks about a kana in terms of stalks of wheat. A stalk of wheat is straight. Likewise, in Sefer Yecheskel, you have a kana to refer to a measuring stick. Now, measuring sticks have to be straight. Go through each example. Almost always you'll say either you can prove one way or another, and in many, many cases you can mamish prove that a kana is something that's not semicircular. So therefore, he's like, if anything, the default should work the other way around. The papashas, we should assume everyone thinks halachzain. If you have strong evidence to suggest that it's semicircular, then fine. That's the first thing he says. The other thing he says is, if you're looking for evidence from the time of the Beis HaMikdash, you don't really have much description. But one thing we do have, because it talks about in the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, after the Churban Beis HaMikdash, after the story of the Chashmonaim, they didn't have a menorah. They had to make a makeshift menorah. How did they make the makeshift menorah? So the lashon is, they used shvudin. First, the Gemara had a havamina that it's shvudin shel eitz. The maskana is, it wasn't shvudin shel eitz, it was shvudin shel barzel. A shvud is like a spit, the type of thing that you would roast an animal on or something like that. A shvud always means a straight pole. So now, we're not talking about the ideal situation, we're not talking about the ideal menorah, but if you're looking for one instance when there's et vas, a description of what the menorah looked like, the one time where they made this makeshift menorah, it says shvud. Shvud means straight. So that, if anything should tip the scales, they're saying that we should assume that these branches are straight. So he's like, I don't understand why Rabbi Yosef Rikiti and Emmanuel Chai Riki, living 100, 200 years before him, why they had this default for the Rambam, because the Rambam didn't say halachzain, it means, semicircular. Rabbi Yeshua Finberg doesn't think that this actually works out and doesn't make sense. And in fact, when the Rebbe eventually addressed the subject much later, in the 1980s, the Rebbe raised similar points. Look at number 7. The Rebbe wrote, V'tzarachi in God. First, on the argument from Rebbe Emmanuel Chai Riki, that because we're trying to symbolize the planets and the sphere, so therefore it needs to be round. Really? One of the 7 is the central branch. The central branch is round? No. Kulei Alma Maida, the central branch just goes up vertically. So how does that work out? Elamai, who cares about the symbolism of the Rekiah? Each one is able to represent a planet and a Rekiah without it looking like in a circular shape. The lashon of the Rebbe, V'tzarech yiyun gadol, ha'im ifarish hagam haneira imso yiyah kamat be'igul. How would that work? Point number 1. Point number 2 about kana. Here the Rebbe says a point that's very similar to what Rabbi Yeshua Finberg said in the 1870s. Lo izochisi lefi ani yazdaiti lovin klal haraya. I don't understand the raya. That because the Rambam didn't say halachzain, therefore it means he holds it semicircular. Why? You have this term many times in Torah Shabbat Chazav. And in many of these instances, it is by definition talking about a straight branch. And to the contrary, though maybe there are some that are ambiguous, you're not going to have one time you're not going to have one time where kana must mean semicircular. Maybe you will say some are unambiguous. So for many times it must be straight. Never it must be semicircular, and sometimes maybe it's ambiguous. So therefore, similar to what Rabbi Yeshua Finberg said, it doesn't seem like the premise that Rabbi Yosef Rikiti and Rabbi Emmanuel Chai Riki were working with doesn't seem to be correct. Okay. This is all the background that this conversation we could have had and we are having without looking at any images and without being familiar with any kisvayad, any manuscripts of this sort. But now let's bring the manuscripts and the kisvayad into the conversation. So you're looking now at the screen is a manuscript that's today in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. It's called the MS Huntington 117. There was a non-Jew who lived in England in the 1600s whose name was Robert Huntington. We're going to be mentioning his name a few times tonight. And he, like some of his fellow Englishmen, go to the Middle East for multiple purposes. And one of the purposes they're there for is to collect manuscripts because they are interested in studying the cultures that live there. Jews, Arabs, Samaritans, and others. And so they're going there and they're going manuscript hunting, looking to collect things and bringing them back to England. And his collection, the Huntington collection today, is part of the Bodleian Library in Oxford. The volume that you're looking at, the piece that you're looking at over here, is the first page of Rambam's Pirush HaMishnayos. Rambam's first famous work is the Pirush HaMishnayos that he wrote a commentary on all of the Mishnayos written in Judeo-Arabic. And this is the first page. And the bottom paragraph of the page on the left-hand side, in Judeo-Arabic, there's a note. The note is translated on the right-hand side of the screen into Hebrew, where it says, Chelek zeh, this volume, Ush'ara chalakim, and the other volumes, meaning there's multiple volumes here, Heim hanuschois hamakoriyos b'chsav yadoi shel Rabbeinu Moshe Zayin Kuf Lamed. So these are the original autographs, Ksav Yodai, the original autographs of the Rambam's Pirush HaMishnayos. In other words, this is his master copy. Every author, when they produce a work, they have the work, the one that they wrote for themselves. This is the volume that is his. He goes on to say that it can never be sold, and you're not allowed to use it as a mashkin, and the family should keep this for all generations, and whoever wants to study from it should be able to come to study from it. And there's a curse for anyone who sells it. Eventually it was sold to Mr. Huntington. And then there's a signature at the bottom. Kasav Shloime ben David ben Avram ben Agoin Rabbeinu Moshe. Now, the Rabbeinu Moshe is not clear in the manuscript on the bottom line there, but it's not entirely clear what happened. It does seem that at least at a point that word may have been clearer. But it's not clear to us today. But it seems that we have over here is an anicle from the Rambam. The Rambam had a son named Avram, who had a son named David, who had a son named Shlomo. And Shlomo is the one who's attesting that his ancestor, the Rambam, is the one who, this is his copy of the Mishnah Torah. In this volume, all you have is Sefer Zroim, meaning the comments on brachas and the other Masechtas like that. Okay, so this comes to England, and it's sitting in a library, and no one knows about it for the 1600s, the second half of the 17th century, no one knows about it. In the 18th century, no one really knows about this until we have the following. There's a Jew by the name of Adolf Neubayer, and he grew up in Austro-Hungarian Empire, and he eventually becomes working in the library at the Bodleian Library, and he's given the task of going through all of the books and all the manuscripts that they have in this library and making a catalog, because till then everything's just sitting around. No one knows what's even there. And so in 1886 he publishes the catalog of the Hebrew manuscripts in the Bodleian Library, and each one has a number, and here you see number 393. He writes Maimonides' commentary on Mishnah Zroim. He writes the owner's name, and then at the bottom you'll see in the parentheses he writes autograph. In other words, he's assuming that this is the autographed copy of the Rambam, and that's how he lists it here. And now the wider world is able to know that this type of thing exists. Doesn't mean anyone really does anything about it this early in the 1880s, but theoretically now knowledge about this copy of the Mishnayos is out in the world. Now, subsequent to that, there was a little bit, and to a degree there still is a little bit of a debate, a scholarly debate about is this indeed written in the Ksav Yad Kodesh of the Rambam or not? And there are some who absolutely, and I think it's the majority, who say this is absolutely his handwriting and it matches up really, really well and it makes perfect sense. Rabbi Kapach, for one, is, for example, someone who endorses this point of view. There have been a few people along the way who said they're not so sure. They're not so sure. They had certain questions and comments, and there was a scholarly debate about this even before World War II. In the 1930s, they were writing about this, in the 1940s and the 1950s. I think if you look at the Oxford, as you look at their book that they have on Judaica, the way they write it is, they write, it seems that it is, but it could be that maybe it's not, but even if it's not, the Rambam for sure wrote Hagois on it. So in other words, even if it's not, the primary text is not the Rambam's, but the Hagois around the side was, which means either it's the Rambam's autographed copy, or it's really, really close to him, it's his, and he's using it and interacting with it every day, and therefore an endorsed copy. So that pretty much is a debate. I don't know if that ever has been resolved, and you have to really go through in details, and it's a little difficult, so I'm passing on that. For our presentation, we are going to assume that this indeed, we're going to paskin like Rabbi Kapach and the many others who say that this indeed is the Ksaviyat of the Rambam. And again, as I said, it does seem that most people are comfortable with that assumption. Okay, but all that is just Sefer Zroim of the Rambam's commentary. And now we introduce Mr. Edward Pocock, who was before Huntington. And similar, he's in England. He goes on a mission to Syria, and he comes back from Syria also with manuscripts, and he publishes a book. The book that he publishes is called Porta Moses. This book he printed in 1655. What did he do? He took the Hakdamas. The Rambam has many interesting Hakdamas. Hakdama to Mishnayos, Hakdama to Saches, to Perek Chelek and Sanhedrin. That's where he formulates the 13 principles. The Hakdama to Pirkei Avos, Shemaina Prakim, and many others Hakdamas. So he felt that this is of value, and he produced the Judeo-Arabic text alongside with a Latin translation. This is what Edward Pocock did. So obviously he's very interested in the Rambam and in his works. And he goes to Syria and he comes back with another volume from this set. And the volume that he comes back from this set is Kachim, which has Maseches Midos, which has the handwriting of the Rambam on the right-hand side, and a graph, which presumably is created by the Rambam as well, of what the Beis HaMikdash would have looked like, a map of the Beis HaMikdash. This is known as Pocock 295. That is his. This particular Ksaviyat. Now let's remember, in the beginning of the first one, it said that Zroim was written by the Rambam and the other volumes. This is 100% that manual. Everyone agrees that whatever din you say on the first one, you say on the second one. There's no disagreement about that. And this is where we come to the famous image, because this is a Maseches Midas you're looking at now. But if you go to the Maseches Menachos, the Gemara, the Mishnah brings up the fact that you needed to have 7 branches on the Menorah, and this is where the Rambam, we spoke about the Menorah, so the Rambam presents the image of the Menorah alongside his text. By the way, on this spread, you're able to see an example of a Hagah that was added in later. That's on the left-hand side. This is Perek Revi of Menachos on the left-hand side. You see a deletion on the bottom left of the page, and all the way on the left, an insert instead. But on the right-hand side of the page is where we come to the image of the Rambam. This is where the image stems from. And obviously this is very different from the, I guess you would say, more common depiction of the Menorah in its semicircular fashion, which is most famous from the Arch of Titus. So we call him Titus. He's the general who is involved or is responsible for the Churban Beis HaMikdash. And about 10 years or so after the Churban Beis HaMikdash, they put up an arch to memorialize the defeat of our people at the hands of the Romans. And this is the arch that they build. And inside they have the following relief, which has a scene of Jews carrying a menorah that has rainbow arched branches. And this is kind of the more famous. Now, a few years ago, there was a scholar, his name is Stephen Fine, who did some testing on the menorah and found small specks of gold paint. From there, he was able to determine that probably originally when this was first revealed or when this was first celebrated, it was painted in gold. And so he proceeded to create an image of what he thinks it may have looked like in the original, something like this. And so here we come to the question, and that is, well, which we have on the one hand, we have the menorah as depicted here and elsewhere, where it's in its where it's round, and on the other hand, we have what the Rambam did in his commentary to the Mishnah, where it is straight. How are we supposed to deal with that issue? It seems that the first person to really address this that I was able to find was Rabbi Yosef Kapach. Rabbi Yosef Kapach is born in Yemen, and Yemen is a very important part of this story, and really all stories related to the Rambam, because they are very adamant about following the Rambam halacha l'maisa, and they're also very careful how they copy and preserve his texts. And so therefore you have very nice and good copies of Moreh Nevuchim, Sefer HaMitzvahs, Pirush HaMishnah Rambam, Mishnah Torah in Yemen, and many of these came to Eretz Yisrael. And Rabbi Yosef Kapach made it his life's mission to publish these Yemenite manuscripts, which he did. And on the left-hand side is his Pirush on Meseches Menachos, meaning he took the Rambam and he retranslated it because the old translation he didn't like. So he retranslated it. He was an expert in Arabic and in Hebrew. He retranslated it, and when he came up to this passage in Menachos, where we have the Menorah, he was working with this Pokak manuscript. He's working with the Pokak manuscript. He figures, you know what, I'm going to put a picture in. And he put this picture in his Menachos. And then he writes as follows in a footnote. Go back to the handout. Let's read what he says in number 9. By the way, in terms of the years, this is 1967. So he's having this conversation about this Menorah, produces his book, produces his image in 1967. Says Rabbi Kapach, Shasheshas hakonim yoitzim v'oilim mekav yashar ad l'goyva Menorah. They're supposed to be straight. Ve'ein bahem shum kashti yoitz klal. There is no rainbowness whatsoever. Unlike the famous image that was copied from the arch of Titus. And in fact, we already know that the arch is not to be taken seriously. Because in the Braisa we learned clearly that Menorah stood on legs. And the Rambam writes both in Mishnayos and in Mishnah Torah that the Menorah stood on legs. But if you go back to this image, it's not standing on legs, it's standing on some sort of wide base. And there are other issues with this image that we don't have to address. He probably is addressing the fact that there are imagery of animals at the bottom of the Menorah, and there are other issues that were brought up by others already previously, but he's the one who brings it up in the context of saying, I don't like this. I like the Rambam's image. I like this image better. I think this is right. I think we need to go with this particular image. Okay, but at the end of the day, this was just a footnote in a book, and I wouldn't say that this had a major impact on Jewish society at the time in 1967 and thereafter. But then, as I alluded to earlier, Shabbos Parshas Mates Tovshin Mem Beis, the Rebbe said as follows: in Pirush HaMishnayos LaRambam Sheboitzas Kapach b'Meseches Menachos Yeshnei Tzir Shal HaMenorah Shetzur B'Ksav Yad Shal HaRambam. If you go to the Kapach edition of Pirush HaMishnayos, you will find over there the picture of the Menorah that was drawn by the Menorah. V'sham Mitzyor and Knei HaMenorah B'tzura so Vav, and there they are Vav-like rather than rainbow-like. B'kav Yashar B'dugmat Tzir Ois Shin. In other words, the Menorah, when you're looking from afar, it looks like a shin. V'loi B'tzuras Chati Keshes, not like a half a rainbow. This is what the Rebbe said in the at the Farbrengen at the time. This was Mates Maseh for Truma Mem Gimel. This Sikha was already prepared for Hagah, was the Likut, for Likut Sikhas of Truma Taf Shin Mem Gimel. And there the Rebbe says, in the Sikha, the Rebbe mentioned it, Dvarim Taf Shin Mem Beis as well, but I'm quoting here from the Likut, the Rebbe said, Nachdem wie es ins Gale geworden, Guf Xaviat Kodesh Harambam mit Tzir HaMenorah is Batal HaYesod u Batal HaBinyan. The entire foundation that Rabbi Emmanuel Chai Riki had before and that Rabbi Yosef Rikiti had before, remember, what did they say? They said, Rashi says halachsein, but the Rambam doesn't say halachsein. And because the Rambam doesn't say halachsein, so we think he's round. Okay? So they're telling you what their logic, they're telling you their thinking. But now we have the Rambam. We have the Rambam in Pirush HaMishnayos. Once you find that the person's, if a Rav or a Mefarish gives a certain logic and a justification of what they're saying, and you pull out the rug from under it and you show how it's flawed, so then essentially you say, we're going to discount what you're saying. We're not going to take that all too seriously, because in fact we see that the Rambam's image is Ba'al Achsain. And so therefore we end up having, as of now, we have a Rashi, Ba'al Achsain, and we have an image of the Rambam in Pirush HaMishnayos that is Ba'al Achsain. And by the way, the image in Likutei Sichos is on the left-hand side, and the image from the Kapach Rambam is on the right-hand side, you'll be able to tell that it's the exact same image. In fact, it seems to me, I didn't ask, but it seems to me that they literally copied from his book, because they didn't have access to the Bodleian library, or they didn't go, or they didn't think it was possible to go, and so they didn't get an original image. You'll see the cutoff at the top, and at the bottom is in the exact same place. Okay, now ever since there has been this discussion, people get very passionate about this. I've seen instances where, in some cases, it brings out the worst in people, unfortunately. This is one of those subjects that trigger people, which is unfortunate. And the reality is that as a result, there's a lot of blog writing and websites and articles and even books addressing this issue. And so much has been written on this, and obviously we're not going to go through all of it. What I want to do is address a few particular questions. And the first question that we're going to address to right now is, okay, you gave me an image from the Rambam. Does the evidence suggest that the Rambam was intentional about his image? Maybe he wasn't intentional about it. It's a valid question to ask. And maybe he wasn't being intentional. And if he wasn't being intentional, then for us to start being medayik would be wrong. What's the argument to say that he wasn't being intentional? Well, the words of the Rambam himself. The words of the Rambam himself, before he produces this image, he writes about it, so we'll look at it. But as you're looking at these words, it's also a good argument for why we should be intentional about this Rambam. It really depends on which words within this paragraph you're going to want to stress. So let's have a look and see how the Rambam introduces this image. This is from the Kapach translation of Maseches Menachos. The Rambam writes as follows: Re'isi l'tzayer kan suras ha-menorah b'shleimusa. I want to give you the full menorah. V'lefnei hatziyar omer, before I make the image, I want to tell you as follows: V'agavia u'getavnis kois atum. The goblets that the menorah had is like a closed cup, a cup that does not have a gap at the top. Ela shoshalayim shaloi tsarim, but the bottom is narrow. Okay, so now the Rambam just described the cups of the menorah, which here are upside down. We'll talk about that soon. Va'akafter hu tavnis kador she'eni gulei meduyak ala ma'urach ma'ar. Then you have the kaftar. So he says, it's like it's circular, but it's not really circular. It's actually more oval. He says it's similar to an egg's chicken. Then he says there's the flower, which is like the sprouting, which is like a sprouting rose. Good. Then he says, okay, so now I describe these three features. So he says, Vani, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to make the goblets just as triangles. The kaftar I'm going to make round, and the flower, the button I'm going to make round, and the flower I'm going to make a half a circle, like a moon. Okay? Why? Because this will just make it easier for me to make this picture. Here's the key words for some. My goal isn't here that you should know exactly how to make the goblet. I already explained to you. I want to tell you the number of the gviyim, the number of the kaftorim, the number of the prachim, and where on the menorah they reside. I also want to show you where in the menorah you actually have nothing, which in the end we didn't get all that much with nothing. I want to show you where you had the kaftorim and the prachim. And generally how this was. And here you get the image. Okay, so you'll have some people who will come along and say, well, let's look at the words. It isn't that you should know exactly how the goblet is. Well, so here we can start a conversation. It isn't how you should know exactly what the goblet should look like. So it isn't really how to know other things as well. And so therefore we can say, don't worry so much about the branches. He just did it that way because it was easier or something like that. What's working against that is the fact that at the bottom he went out of his way to make a semicircular base. And for that it's a pretty symmetrical job that he did there, and shows you that he had a compass. So in other words, it's, to suggest that he didn't have the ability to make something semicircular, that's a little different. But at the end of the day, that's what some people want to say. And on the other hand, you could read this text and say, he's just telling you not to get carried away with how he's making these goblets. But something as general as the first thing you see when you see this menorah is its shape. To the contrary, he's trying to tell you, I want you to know, vichlalusa heyach oisa. How does he end off? I want you to know generally how this is. Well, what does it mean generally? Well, one of the things that it should mean is its overall look, which is whether it's halachzain or if it's semicircular. And so, obviously, I think it makes more sense to read this text in a way in where the Rambam is saying that he wants to be intentional about this specific detail. Now, what I want to show you is that there were other people who understood the Rambam in this way, who thought he's being intentional. And how would I know that they thought of that way? Because, well, look how they copied the Pirush HaMishnayos when they made, remember, it's before the age of printing, so they're doing their own copies. So here you have a pretty old manuscript of the Pirush HaMishnayos of the Rambam. It is still in Arabic. This was not translated. In other words, the people who commissioned this and read this were comfortable in Arabic. Indeed, it is thought that this was copied in Spain, sometime between, in the last part of the 13th century. When you see a library saying 1276, 1300, because they divide it in quarters. What they're doing is they're just saying, we think it's from the last quarter of the century because of the way the calligraphy or the way the paper is, whatever it is. But anyway, this is actually part of the Bodley collection. The Bodleian Library in Oxford is named for Mr. Bodley. He's the founder of this thing, and this manuscript is part of his collection. And you can see over here that we have the same chapter, Menachos, the Pirush HaMishnayos. On the left-hand side, you have the person making the menorah and doing it in the same way. He actually gave much more space in this particular image, which allowed there to be more blank space along each one of the kanim, which the Rambam himself said he wanted to do, but didn't end up doing. And here, by the way, the cups are not upside down. Here they're actually in the way that he actually changed. So here you have someone who is brazen enough, so to speak, to change the cups because he thinks that's a problem, but the kanim are still ba'alachsoin in this particular copy. Havei omer, what does this mean? Here you have someone, a scribe, sometime in the 13th century, who sees what the Rambam did or sees these copies, taking that very seriously, and then continuing that transmission. Here's another example. This is a Yemenite manuscript. A little later, from the 14th or 15th century, same thing, Pirush HaMishnayos for Menachos, and same idea. Here the cups are turned over, and that was preserved, but of course the alachzoin was preserved in this particular manuscript as well. And so here we have Al Pishnayim Eidim Yakum Davar. There are probably others, but these are the two that I saw, and where you see they took the Rambam as being intentional about this particular issue. But the emes is that there's probably no better witness to this question than the Rambam's son. The Rambam had a son named Reb Avram ben Harambam, and he wrote a number of Jewish works. But one of the works that he wrote was a Pirush on Chumash, and this was not known. It's quoted almost by nobody from the time that he wrote it until the 20th century. And the reason for that is it was in Aleppo, together with these other manuscripts we were talking about before that were in Aleppo, and it was purchased by Mr. Huntington. And this was one manuscript. It's not an autograph, meaning it's not assumed that this is the Ksav Yad Kodesh of Reb Avram ben Harambam, but it's someone who copied the Pirush. This is the only manuscript left from this Pirush that exists in the world. It's Huntington 166. I guess at this point I should give a comment. You may be wondering, why are all these Maimonidean manuscripts coming out of Aleppo? This is the third one that we're talking about, 2 volumes of the Pirush HaMishnah, and now Reb Avram ben Harambam's commentary. But the explanation for that is rather simple. The Rambam's descendants, I don't remember exactly when, 3-4 generations after the time of the Rambam, picked up and left and moved to Aleppo in Syria. And so it stands to reason that they would have taken the most important parts of their archive, they would have taken with them. It's unfortunate, although it may be fortunate as well, but it is unfortunate that some of that was sold in the 17th century to non-Jews. It may be fortunate because, who knows, maybe it would not have been preserved were it not for that. But that's another story for another time. Anyway, when it comes to Parshas Truma, here we have you have the words of Rabbi Avram ben Harambam over here writing in Judeo-Arabic, but you could see Kimot Surah Abba Marizal, like the picture of my father. Be'astakama'a is the Judeo-Arabic word for Ba'alachson, or straight. And he says loy, and then he goes on to say in Judeo-Arabic, not in the way that it's done semicircular, the way other people have done it. So he here is testifying, this is not an accident. first of all, he's telling us his father made a picture of the Rambam, the image of the Rambam. So we had that discussion before. Oh, is that manuscript? Is it from the Rambam? Is it not? Well, here the fact that the Rambam made a menorah, we actually have his son telling us, and the fact that it needs to be Ba'al Achzain, Rabbi Avram ben Rambam is telling us that indeed that's the right way to do it, unlike the others. He says, unlike the way other people are doing it. This would be an example of from the time maybe Rabbi Avram ben Rambam comes in contact with something like this, because this is found in the Cairo Gnisa. It's dated to 11th, 12th century. It's something for children to learn the Aleph Beis, and on the right-hand side, there's a picture of the menorah, one of many, many, many. I'm just giving one example that comes from that era where Rabbi Avram ben Rambam is writing and saying, not the way other people are making it around. So here is something from his backyard that was happening around that time. Okay, so in terms of our question, is the Rambam being intentional? The answer seems to be yes. However, I want to show you the following. This one's a little bit of an enigma. Here you have a Ksav Yad that is dated to the year 1312, meaning this is the colophon at the end of the Ksav Yad is saying, Nishlam Belil, hey, Parshas Vayakol Pekudei, when he finishes in the year Ayin Beis, right? So the year Ayin Beis is 1312. Okay, so he wrote, what is this? A Pirush Rashi. So here it says at the top, Chasalas v'Zois HaBracha. He finished giving you a Pirush Rashi. And here, in Parshas Truma, you have an image of the Menorah. How would you define these branches, right? They're not straight, they're not rainbow, they're kind of somewhere in between. All right, fine. So, now, we're going to have a discussion about the images in Rashi. Remember, Rashi says there are Ba'al Achzain. And here we have this particular image. Notice, by the way, the cups here are also upside down. Okay, and then there's a note at the bottom of this image. So let's have a look. Let's have a read of what this note says. So the note says as follows: Za'atzir hu lefi Pirush HaMishnah me'Rambam Zal. This image that I'm giving you here is Rambam's menorah. V'loi kefi girsas Rabbeinu Shloima, not like Rashi. Okay, now I didn't spend all that much time on this, but so what does that mean? He's telling you this is Rambam's menorah, not Rashi. So is it because of the upside down cups, which the only marker for that is the Rambam? So is that what he's saying? Is it because of the foot of the menorah here? You'll see that Rashi says it's a teva, it's like a box at the bottom that holds up the menorah. There, it looks more like a triangular piece. Is that what he's talking about? Maybe there's some other machlokes, or I don't know. Maybe is he referring to? To be honest with you, I'm not entirely sure what he's referring to. But here's the thing. He's telling you that this is Rambam. But this is semicircular. It's at least somewhat semicircular. In other words, although I'm trying to be honest with you, although I was bringing before from Kisayat and Manuscripts, where I was showing that these copyists were taking the Rambam very seriously, Ba'al Achzain, here we have someone who's telling you, by the way, I'm following Rambam, and he didn't seem to take the Al Achzain all too seriously, and he put it up this way. Okay, that's fine. He's entitled to his opinion. That was what he. So yes, I did show you that a nice number took the Rambam's Al Achzain very seriously. Here you have one who didn't seem, or maybe he wasn't sure, definitely wasn't married to the Rambam's Al Achzain. He thought he's doing Rambam with this particular image. Okay, and now we come to the next part. And that is what about Rashi Taka? How did the people who were writing manuscripts, how did they treat Rashi? They must have seen that Rashi said Ba'al Achzain. So when it came to drawing the menorah, what did they do? So here, there isn't so much that's Ba'al Achzain. Here is one example of a Rashi that is Ba'al Achzain. This is 1305, somewhere in Spain. Today it's in Italy, in Parma. The library in Parma has a lot of chashva, important manuscripts. And this is Parshas Truma, and you have a picture here of the Rambam, where the Rashi says is Ba'al Achzain, and you see the image of the menorah here, Ba'al Achzain. As far as I can tell, this is the only one from a number, I checked about 10, that do Rashi, that give imagery, and almost all the others, they don't care. So what does that mean? We'll talk about it in a second, but first let me show you some examples. So here's an example. This is an early Ksav Yad from the early 1200s. This is part of the Oppenheim collection at the Bodleian Library. He was a rabbi in Prague and in other places. And here you see Rashi, Parshas Truma, Menorah that does all types of interesting things, including the fact that it's Chatzoi Eagle. Here you have a colophon of what's known as the Munich Rashi. The Munich Rashi is a very important Ksav Yad for Rashi because it's, relatively speaking, copied early on, 1233 as an exact date. This one is an estimate. This has an exact date, 1233. It has a scribe. He says his name. His name is, here we can make it bigger, I think. His name is, he's excited, he finished the work, Baruch Hashem La'olam Amen V'Amen. And then he tells you, Ani Shloime B'Reb Shmuel, I'm from Würzburg, so now we know where he is, place in Germany. Kasafti Eli Pirushin Shal Arba'in Ve'esrin Svarim, he's writing who he wrote it for, and it gives you the year. Arba Salafin Shamei Sutishim Ushleisha, that is the year 1233. And I didn't study this too closely, but when it comes to the text of Rashi and what's the best text of Rashi, this manuscript's always in the conversation. And when you come to Parshas Truma, this is the image you see on the right-hand side. It says Nishla Maise Menorah Pisraina, like the finished Rashi on terms of the meaning of the interpretation of the Menorah. And here you have a different model of Menorah where it kind of goes out and then goes upward. Not al-Achzain, but also not Chatzoi Igul, a different type of model, but this doesn't look like al-Achzain. Here's another example of a Ksav Yad from Rashi. This one's a very hectic Menorah with all types of animal things that are going on over here. Also on Parshas Truma, also not Ba'al Achzain. And the final example I'll show you of a Rashi is this one over here. I believe this is like at the end of Sefer Shmos by Yaakov Akudei. I don't have this in color. It was not available. But you have here two images, and I'm not sure why. The author does not explain why he produced two images of the Menorah, but both of them are not al-Achzain, though the one on the left may be an attempt at some level of being al-Achzain. I don't know. The bottom line is, and by the way, with this one, you see, this one is, this is a piece of art. There's no indication here. I am trying to teach you about what the Menorah looks like, right? Same thing even here. There's no indication here of measurements or anything. I'm not trying, you don't have any of that, okay? Here as well. There's no indication of, I'm trying to teach you something here. Okay? Here on the other hand, no. Yeah. Here on the other hand, you do. Look, you say perach, gvia, perach, right? Here the person is acting a little more like a teacher. So the reason I'm saying this is because here for the first time you have Rashi. It's not Ba'al Achzain, and there also seems to be a teacher in the room trying to show you, yeah, this is how it works or whatever. Why am I saying this? Because basically, how do you approach this? So one thing you could say is, they looked at Rashi, they saw it said al-Achzain, they touched al-Achzain, kamin semicircular. Okay, I personally don't think that's what happened. What happened is, Rashi said al-Achzain, okay, he can say what he wants. I'm making a Menorah, and I'm making a Menorah that I'm more comfortable with, that we're more familiar with, or that I think looks nicer. In fact, we did a class last year where there was Inyan and Svard about putting imagery of the Beis Hamikdash in the beginning of a Chumash. And so, yeah, it's a nice thing just to have an image without it being there to measure or to be exact. And so, yeah, you could say they think al-Achzain means on an semicircular. That's not my read. My read is they ignored al-Achzain, didn't pay too much attention to it, and just said they want to do whatever they want to do. So I don't think, to come back to the question, so did these artists take Rashi seriously when Rashi said the word al-Achzain? The answer is, well, one of them did. The others, I'm not really sure. They may have just ignored him or not really cared. Okay. Now we have to continue in our journey as follows. And that is... We're talking about the Rambam, and we're talking about Pirush HaMishnayos. We're left with a little bit of a gap. And the reason is because a person can come along and say, Pirush HaMishnayos? What's Pirush HaMishnayos? I'm Sefer Hayad. I follow what it says in Sefer Hayad. And guess what? Sefer Hayad, there's nothing. No information whatsoever. There's no picture. If you open your classic set of Mishnah Torah, you will not find any picture. If you don't find any picture, so you can basically say, maybe you could even go so far as to say, in the Madura Kama and Pirush HaMishnayos, the Rambam put it out in a certain way. But then he decided when it came to Mishnah Torah, you know what, it doesn't matter, or he doesn't know, maybe it's this or maybe it's that, and so he omitted the whole thing. So don't get all too passionate about what's going on in Pirush HaMishnayos. Okay. The emes is, when you look at Kisvei Yad, of the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, you find images of the Menorah. And initially, it's not going to be such good news. So here, this is called the Kaufman Mishnah Torah. This is from France, produced in the year 1296. Today it's in Hungary. And along the way, there's a few pieces of art. Some hard to tell exactly what the meaning is. So for example, here you have a knight with an arrow, with a shield, sitting on a horse, mounted horse, and a helmet. It looks like he's shooting an arrow at a beehive or something like that. I'm not entirely sure what that is. Okay, but along the way you have some of those just interesting things in art. But here you have Perek Shlishi of Hilchos Beis HaBchira, where the Rambam is talking about the Menorah, and you have a chashva piece of art over here of a semicircular Menorah that is put in 1296. It's like the Rambam is not even, he was alive less than 100 years before. You have here this design Menorah. And this is not the only one. If you went to the Rambam exhibits, in addition to seeing the Pokak manuscript that we saw before in Pirush HaMishnayos from Maseches Menachos, you also saw this there. What's this? So this here is in JTS in New York. It's produced in Germany sometime in the 13th or 14th centuries. Same thing. Hilchos Beis HaBchira, the Rambam. And you have here a semicircular Menorah standing on three legs, which is not the way the Rambam had it at the bottom. The Rambam's model at the bottom is semicircular, and standing on two grotesques, or two animals that are merged into one, a yellow and a red. So obviously this artist isn't expecting you to take it literal, and that's something to keep in mind. But the reality is, you look at these two kisvei yad and you're like, oh, we have some manuscripts here that have actually Rambam's Menorah, where it's being done not ba'alachsoin. And by the way, there are words in these two Rambams that we don't have in the standard print. And that is, after he describes a Menorah, it says, V'zu hi tzurasa. V'zu hi tzurasa. V'zu hi tzuras ha-Menorah. Okay. That's not presented in the standard editions of Rambam. So it seems like we have the words Zuhi Tzuras HaMenorah, and we have these two roundies. Okay. However, in addition to having those roundies, we also have manuscripts from the Rambam, Mishnah Torah, where this was produced, where it was done ba'alachsai. This is one example from Spain in 1460, today in the National Library in Eretz Yisrael. Here also it says V'zui Tzurasa. Here is, however, an important manuscript that we need to talk about. And there are a number of these that exist. And first, before we read this, I want to call your attention to another passage of Rabbi Avram ben Arambam. Rabbi Avram ben Arambam writes in that same passage, if you look at number 14, Uvehilchos Beis HaBchira min hachibur upirish mishnas menachis timsa sha'ar tzuras hamneira bishlemusa. Look in two places to find the perfect Menorah. Look in my father's Pirush HaMishnayos, but also look at the Chibur in Hilchos Beis HaBchira. What are we learning here? We're learning here that if you had Rambam's master copy of Mishnah Torah, which we do not have today, but if you had his master copy of Sefer Avodah, you would find the same image. The same image. Rabbi Avram ben Arambam is telling us it's the same image. You'll find the same image that you had in Pirush HaMishnayos, you will have over there as well. And so when you have these manuscripts producing Menorah, these aren't artists just saying, hey, we did it when we did Parshas Truma, we threw in an image, let's do it here. No. These images that are being produced and presented, this one and this one, all of these images, they're following in the footsteps of the Rambam, because that's the manuscript of the Rambam. When it was issued, it had an image in it, and they were doing that. In fact, there are the words, V'zuhi Tzurasa, in all of the manuscripts of the Rambam have those words. What happens is sometimes the scribe just didn't make a picture and left it blank. But the word Zui Tzurasa he left in. When the printers printed, they're working with a manuscript of Zui Tzurasa, and they didn't have an image, and they weren't about to print the image anyway, so they took out those words. And that's how it was forgotten that Bachlal, the Rambam, actually had a tzir in his Mishnah Torah. It was there. Now the shaila is, what's the original? We know it's the original from what Rabbi Avram says, because Rabbi Avram tells us it's the same image that was here in Pirush HaMishnayos. So we pretty much know what it was. Maybe he executed a little neater because it was a few years later. He had a little more experience. That's possible, but we know that on the central issue of the shape of the Menorah, the Rambam had it there in the way of Balachsai. And so when you look at this manuscript here, this one is closer to the original than these fancy artists who, these Gvirim, commissioned these very chashva and lavish manuscripts, you can tell, And they went to an artist and they said, okay, we're going to have fun. We're going to do something really nice and something really impressive. They got carried away. In a sense, they're still reflecting the Rambam in that there is an image here, but this is no longer tethered to the original source as opposed to this one. But now let's come talk about this manuscript here. Let me just tell you the background. After the Rebbe said his Sikha, Matas Maseh and Dvarim Tavshim and Beis, the Rebbe produced for Likutei Sichos the next year, Truma, a likut on this subject. A few months, that's Truma Mem Gimel. A few months later, there was Yid in Eretz Yisrael, Rabbi Yeshua Munshain, Zechreinu Levracha, who wrote an article on the Kfar Chabad. And he wrote that he identified 3 manuscripts of the Mishnah Torah, not Pirush HaMishnayos, that have it the way the Baal Achzain. And so he produces in the Kfar Chabad. So this is interesting. This information was added months later into the Likud of Likutei Sichos. So if you look at the Sikha, you'll see Ha'ara 11 has a star next to it. The reason it has a star, this is often the case, the Ha'ara has a star is because they didn't want to mess up all the numbers. So instead of they needed to add a new footnote a few months in, so they added 11 star. The only thing is you need to be careful about it. There are cases where sometimes they didn't want you to know which one was added in later. So what they did is, even if it was added earlier, they moved the star to a different one. Okay, so you can't get too carried away and think that always one that has a star means it was added later, because sometimes it was smoke and mirrors. But anyway, here, this one we know was added a good few months later, Ha'ara 11. And look what the Rebbe writes in this Ha'ara. Ha'ara la'acher zman. Shuv nisparsam ksav yad de Sefer Hayad. Now it has become brought to our attention that there's a manuscript of Sefer Hayad. V'sham behilchos beis ha'bchira perek gimel sef halacha yud. Isa, it says, V'zui tzurasa. You have the words, this is the image. V'yesh sira Menorah, kamay be'pirush HaMishnayos, v'gam sham agviyim mitzuyarim pm lamata v'shuleim lamayla. And there you have both things. Number one, the cups are upside down, and v'chen hakanim oilim ba'al achzain. Which manuscript the Rebbe is referring to here, I don't know. Rabbi Munshain produced 3, but the most impressive of the 3 was this one. And there are others. I want to make it clear there are others. So for example, if you look, at this Rambam exhibit, so here's the catalog of the exhibit. So if you go there, they have this image over here. This is a Yemenite manuscript. It's from the Hartman collection. They date it to 1596. So this is there. And you see Taka Mishnah Torah, and it's there Baal Achzain. It's a small image. This is one example. There are numerous examples of Mishnah Torah that is done Baal Achzain. And the common denominator of all those is that they're Sfarim Meduyakim. In other words, you're able to tell that these were very careful, very careful works. So amongst these 5 or 6 that I've seen, and I don't know how many there are, this one I want to focus on right now. And then with this, we'll start wrapping things up. What you have over here is the tzir of the Menorah. You see the cups are upside down, and you see it's Baal Achzain. So it could be this is the one that the Rebbe is referring to of the 3, and this is in the Mishnah. This is in the Mishnah Torah. Now I want to show you when it comes later to describing the layout of the Beis Hamikdash. Our manuscript now, we're calling it's Hunting 452. Huntington 452 comes from the same Robert Huntington who went to the same place and got the same manuscript. On the left-hand side is the layout of the Beis Hamikdash. This is the layout of the Beis Hamikdash on the Rambam Pirush HaMishnayos, and you'll see how close these are to each other. In other words, this author is being really careful with his work here, because his Beis Hamikdash in his Mishnah Torah is reflecting the Beis Hamikdash the way the Rambam did it in Pirush HaMishnayos. At the end of Sefer Avodah, we get a Kalafin. This is priceless information. He got these Sefer Avodah. I edited this Sefer. Let's talk about this for a second. When you go to a Sefer and you say, please write me a Rambam, that's only half the job. You then need to do the second half, and that is you need to pay a Magia, or you need to be Magia yourself. That is, you need to check it against a good copy to make sure that what you got is good. Right? Similar today when you go to a Sefer and you buy tefillin, and then you'll get it computer checked as well. So he got these Sefer Avodah, Minuscha, from a certain version. Which version? Shalea Ksav Yadoi Shel Moirenu V'Rabbeinu V'Adoinenu Hamayin HaMizgaber Patish HaChazak Ora Olam Chacham Adaru Ployer Oitzar HaChachma. Okay, so as I said before, if you ever get uncomfortable about too many honorifics given to someone, you just come back to some of these letters in the Cairo Gniza, whatever, in this example as well. Okay, 2 lines of honorifics for the Rambam. Moshe ben Reb, Rosh Tevis, Gimel Dalet Kuf. Sorry, excuse me, I don't know what that is. Mereinu V'Adenenu Maimon. Zayin Kuf Lamed. I guess that's similar to Zecher Sadik Levracha on some level. V'zen Nuchas Kav Yada. Okay, so I copied it from the following book, and this is what the book says. Huga Misifri, edited from against my copy, V'kasav Moshe B'Rabbi Maimon Zatzal. And now I'm writing V'kasav Nasan Alevi Ben Mordechai. Let me explain what's going on over here, because this is actually an amazing thing. This brings us back to another item on exhibit, and the Rambam exhibit is this. This is another manuscript. It's called Huntington 80. This is one of the most famous Rambam manuscripts. In a nutshell, without doing too much of an arichis, the handwriting is a professional scribe. But at the end, at the bottom left, you have the words, Huga Misifri Ani Moshe B'Rabbi Maimon. Here it is in bigger, Huga Misifri Ani Moshe B'Rabbi Maimon. This is Rambam's handwriting. It matches up very well with the Rambam's handwriting that we know from other places, including the Cairo Gniza and elsewhere. So what happened here? What's the story? So the story in a nutshell is, as we spoke about at the tours at the Rambam exhibit, you have someone who commissions a Rambam. He then comes to the Rambam and says, I want to be Magia against your master copy. You have the best copy in town. I want to check one against yours. And then before he leaves, he's smart. He says, please sign the book. And the Rambam does. Huga Misifri Ani Moshe Rabbi Maimon. In the Hakdama of this volume, it says that there's an entire set of Mishnah Torah like this. Meaning there's an entire set of Mishnah Torah. It's not written by the Rambam's Ksav Yad. It's written by a professional scribe. But the Rambam writes at the end of each one of these volumes, Huga Misifri, that these volumes were edited against his copies. Good. There's not a scholarly debate whether it could be Rambam even eventually adopted these and started writing in his own edits into these volumes as well. We don't need to go into that. The bottom line is, at the very least, this is an authorized copy, authorized by the Rambam himself, Huga Misifri Ani Moshe Rabbi Maimon. The Hakdama of this volume says that we have it for the whole set. The reality is that today we don't have this whole set. We only have Huntington 80, which is Mada and Ava. That's it. The rest is not around. Seems that something happened to them. But we know they existed because the Hakdama said they existed. And that's what we're seeing over here now. Here, you're seeing echoes of those non-existent manuscripts. There was a manuscript just like that of Sefer Avodah. And at the bottom, it was written by Yankel the scribe, whoever it was. It was brought to the Rambam's house. It was edited against Rambam's copy. The Rambam signed it and said, Huga Misifri Ani Moshe Rabbi Maimon. Then this volume is copied from that. Maybe there's one in between, but it doesn't matter. What you have over here is you have like a direct line to the Rambam's living room. That's what you have over here in this volume that has, we see, a careful plan of the Beis HaMikdash and a very careful drawing of the Menorah in this particular way. And as a result of this, you know the rest of the story, that the Rebbe then advocated that we should use this type of image as much as possible, stationary, even for Chanukah Menorahs, because look what we have. We have the Rambam, we have Rashi, against what? Against Reb Emanuel Chayriki and against the other Reb Yosef Rikiti, who didn't have all this information and have very weak arguments. Archaeology. So really, you do a whole nother session just on this. But in a nutshell, I don't have to tell you that the reality is that the way Psak works and the way the typical Fruma Yid works is archaeology ahin, archaeology aher. The way we kind of work, the way we kind of paskin in these areas is based on the Rabbanim, based on the Tzaddikim, based on the Gdolei Olam, who wrote what they wrote. And so when you have the Arch of Tithis versus this, the Arch of Tithis is not going to, and by the way, there are other coins. In fact, most of the things that you're going to find from the archaeological record before the Churban Beis HaMikdash, after Churban Beis HaMikdash, there are semicircular menorahs, let's be honest. Almost all of them, 95% of them. There are some that are Ba'al Achsain. And that's, by the way, interesting, the fact that there are some Ba'al Achsain. But the archaeological record is what the archaeological record is. But I think what Rabbi Kapach's point was, and I think the Rebbe's point was, is that we kind of don't, that's not how we build our lives. That's not how Yidden choose to behave. And then a year later, the Rebbe had this whole sikha about the tzitz, which without going into too much, it was Tav Shemem Gimel. The Rebbe spoke about how we don't care about an archaeological find in Rome where one of the Tanoim said he saw the tzitz and it was written a certain way. I don't know. It's not part of the Messiah. I don't know what happened. Maybe there was another tzitz. Maybe, who knows? It come up with 100 different theories. We work with the Messiah. The Chacham had a Messiah that the tzitz was done differently, then we're going differently. And I think that's pretty much the attitude. Now, what was interesting is that in Tavshem Mem Gimel, right around during this period in time, there was a Hatzah in Eretz Yisrael to do a coin. And they wanted to put maybe a luchas or a menorah on the coin. It would be a special coin for Hanukkah. It would be an official thing, produced by Chabad together with the Israeli government. I don't know exactly all of the details. They wrote to the Rebbe about this. The Rebbe wrote as follows, look at number 16 in the Minor, the winter in Tavshem Mem Gimel. Habatuach sheyasem mirubois. Are you sure that when they make the luchas, it's going to be with flat tops, squares? If you're not sure, don't even bring up the possibility of doing the luchas. Not to get into a machloikas. You don't want to get into machloikas. On the other hand, you can't compromise. Why can't you compromise about the luchas? Because it's contrary to the Gemara. So we can't compromise. On the other hand, we don't want to get into fights, so just take it off the agenda. The Rebbe wrote differently. You should try Try that it should be like the Rambam. Because there were Gdei Yisrael even in the Rambam's day who disagreed. So here, you're able to give in if it's necessary. Who's the Rebbe? Who's these Gdei Yisrael in the time of the Rambam who disagreed with the Rambam? So what happens is there's an Even Ezra who talks about the menorah being circular. The issue is, and the Rebbe notes in Lekutei Sichos, it's very possible and perhaps even likely that what he was referring to was like a chandelier model, and that is you had the central one, and then you had 7 kanim around it, not around as a full circle, but as a half circle. So a central kan here, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 6 going around in that way. And if that's the case, then he completely means something else. And the Rebbe brings in Lekutei Sichos that it could be. But it seems that the Rebbe is allowing that maybe the Even Ezra actually meant the artistic semicircular ones that we've been viewing. And if so, you have something to rely on. You have some Gdei Yisrael. And by the way, another point, it's not Hebech Hashas. That's for sure. It's not Hebech Hashas. And so therefore, there's a little more, so to speak, wiggle room when it comes to this. Now, there's this book called The Menorah by Professor Stephen Fine. He's the one who did the study on the Arch of Titus that I mentioned before. And look, he brings a lot of these discussions, a lot of these issues. What I felt when I was reading this book was that he wasn't giving enough, taking these points that we raised today seriously enough. So for example, when it comes to the Rambam spiritual Mishnayos, he says it's a scribble. It's a scribble. It's a doodle, a scribble. I think he used the word a scribble, and we're not going to really work with that. When it comes to Rabbi Avram ben Rambam saying about the Rambam, he says that's interesting, but then refuses to build anything on that. And Ba'al Achzain, Rashi, he says, well, maybe Al Achzain means semicircular. So, I feel that although he's very passionate, I understand it, about the archaeology, and he likes archaeology, and the Arch of Titus is very meaningful for him and all that, and I understand that and I respect that, I think at the end of the day, what needs to happen over here is there needs to, because I saw in other places, the tone needs to be a little more respectful. People need to understand that from Jews take the Rambam and Rashi very, very seriously. And to just kind of laugh it off in that way, I don't feel is fear to the conversation. But at the end of the day, the main Nakoda you see all over here, as the Rebbe you see in this minor, doesn't want that we should be involved in machloikas. That's why for the luchas, take it off. And for Menorah, Lenasa, it should be like the Rambam, but if need be, you can be Mavater, because the idea of us as Yidden getting along and respecting each other's positions, even if we disagree with each other, but not chas v'shalom to laugh and not chas v'shalom to mock each other and to try to get along, I think would be very, very good lesson that we should take from the Menorah. There are 7 branches on the Menorah. It represents the 7 different types of Yidden, but we're all part of one Miksha Zav, we're all part of one people, and the more we recognize that, will be better for us as individuals, will be better for us as a people. The Eibusha should help that we should see the Menorah b'mheira v'yameinu, and then all the sfeikus and questions will go away.